From the studios of KPFK Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles, this is Uprising, and I'm Sonali. It's Thursday, April 23rd, 2015. As the sentencing phase of Dzhokar Tsarnaev's trial proceeds, we'll turn to writer and educator Amir Nasr. He's the author of My Isl, How Fundamentalism Stole My Mind and Doubt Freed My Soul. And on the second anniversary of the Rana Plaza disaster in Bangladesh, journalist Tania Rashid will discuss why justice is still elusive. Plus, 5 years after the passage of SB 1070, how have undocumented immigrants in Arizona fared? Gerardo Torres will answer that question. That's coming up after the news. Joining us now to analyze today's headlines is Chenjerai Kumanyika. He's an assistant professor of communication studies at Clemson University. Hi, Chenjerai.
Hi, how you doing?
Doing well, thanks for joining us. Senior Obama administration officials have just admitted that a CIA drone strike in Pakistan killed 2 foreign hostages being held by Al-Qaeda. The strike in January targeted an Al-Qaeda group, but 2 aid workers, an American named Warren Weinstein and an Italian named Giovanni Loporto, were being held captive at the compound and died as a result of the strike, as concluded in an official White House review of the incident. The Wall Street Journal describes it as, quote, the first known instance in which the U.S. has accidentally killed a hostage in a drone strike. While there has been no official curtailment of drone strikes as a result, the website called the Long War Journal has found that the rate of U.S. strikes on Pakistan this year is dramatically lower than the same time last year. Chenjerai, could this incident prompt President Obama to reduce reliance on this internationally condemned method of war?
Well, what we're seeing here is a gesture towards transparency, at least. But the Obama administration has continually defended its position on drone strikes. Tragedies like this highlight why that kind of logic doesn't really work. At least 2,400 people have now been killed by U.S. drone strikes. 314 have been civilians since Obama took office. And so what we're actually seeing is Obama ramping up counterterrorism campaigns using drones and manned aircraft in the Middle East and North Africa, where Al-Qaeda and ISIS are growing. So, we need to put pressure for them to reduce these kind of strikes, but I'm not sure that we are moving in that direction.
A farmer publicly hanged himself at a rally in the Indian capital of New Delhi yesterday as hundreds of people protesting looked on in horror. A suicide note that was reportedly found in his pocket revealed the farmer's name as Gajendra Singh, although the note has not yet been verified. He had apparently traveled to New Delhi from his home state of Rajasthan as a result of losing his crop because of unseasonable weather. Members of India's nascent Aam Aadmi Party, or Party of the Common Man, had gathered in the capital when the farmer, who was up in a tree, hung himself using his scarf. Prime Minister Narendra Modi tweeted, quote, "At no point must the hard-working farmer think he is alone. We are all together in creating a better tomorrow for the farmers of India." But Modi has championed the Land Acquisition Act, which protesters were targeting. That act makes it easier for the government and corporations to buy land from farmers. India has long suffered epidemic levels of farmers' suicides. Chenjerai, should this man's suicide be seen in this political context of corporate profiteering and even climate change rather than an isolated incident?
Absolutely. The growth of the Indian economy, including land reforms that are understood to be predatory, has really hit rural populations of India the hardest. And then in the circumstance of climate change, we see this being exacerbated. So these kinds of land acquisition laws, critics of them feel that they would actually harm the farmers by making it easier for businesses and the government to buy their land. So this response is also not isolated. We have 600 farmers killed themselves in the Maharashtra state in the last 3 months alone. In 2014, there were almost 2,000 farmer suicides. So we have to find a way to provide livelihoods, not only to labor already attached to agriculture, but also to the increasingly urban displaced populations who are moving to rural areas.
And Maharashtra happens to be my home state of India, so this certainly is a story that cuts close to home. Finally, here in the United States, the family of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, will file a civil lawsuit against former officer Darren Wilson. Brown's parents, Michael Brown Sr. and Leslie McSpadden, are speaking at a news conference this morning to reveal the details of their suit. A grand jury last year declined to charge Wilson for the shooting death of their teenage son. A civil suit requires a lower burden of of proof than a criminal trial. Meanwhile, in Baltimore, Maryland, where protests continue over the death of Freddie Gray, who sustained fatal injuries after his arrest, media are reporting that one of the officers had a history of violence. Lieutenant Brian Rice, who had chased Gray, had once had a temporary restraining order against him after he threatened to kill a man, revealing a, quote, pattern of intimidation and violence. Well, Chenjerai, victims of police brutality are often judged quite harshly in the ensuing media coverage for things like past arrests or drug use, etc. But we should be actually examining the pasts of the killers, shouldn't we?
I think we should. You know, as families try to get information about how their loved ones have died and accountability, they have to watch as police departments and the media tear down the character of their loved ones with posthumous and speculative attacks. So it's, meanwhile, as Radley Balco has written, a misbehaving police officer can, rack up huge amounts of citizen complaints that should have thrown up red flags. Violent and abusive cops continue to benefit from job protections that require them to actually rape or kill before they can even be considered to be fired, and even then it's difficult. So now in the case of, in Baltimore is a particularly egregious case, although we're seeing this national pattern. This has happened before in the case of Tyrone West, where we see, officers Nicholas Chapman and Bernard Ruiz with really questionable histories. And so the Department of Justice is learning that, and, we'll have to see what happens from this.
I want to thank you so much, as always, for joining us today, Chenjerai.
Thank you.
Chenjerai Kumanyika is an assistant professor of communication studies at Clemson University and our daily Newsflash guest expert on Thursdays. This is Uprising. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali. News reports emerged early this week that the head of the Islamic State group, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, was so seriously injured in an airstrike in western Iraq that he no longer oversees the day-to-day control of the organization. It is the third such report of a strike assumed to have injured al-Baghdadi, but this time, two separate anonymous sources have confirmed the injury. The U.S.-led war on ISIS has sought to extend the same approach that it took against al-Qaeda, focused airstrikes aimed at so-called high-value targets. But the war seems not to have blunted the Islamic State's brutality. 30 Ethiopian Christians were shown to be beheaded and shot in videos recently released by ISIS. The victims were referred to as crusaders by ISIS soldiers. Meanwhile, here in the United States, a very different type of accountability for terrorist acts is playing out. A jury in April convicted Dzhokar Tsarnaev of all 30 counts for which he was charged for his role in the Boston Marathon bombing that killed 3 people and injured hundreds. A sentencing trial has just begun, during which jurors were shown a photo of Tsarnaev showing his middle finger to the camera after being captured. The photo is intended to make the case that he remained, quote, unrepentant even after being arrested. A debate is now underway on whether he should receive the death penalty. My guest is Amir Nasr. He's a writer and educator. He's the author of My Isl, How Fundamentalism Stole My Mind and Doubt Freed My Soul. His article about ISIS was widely read. It was entitled, "ISIS Isn't the Real Enemy. The Game of Thrones Medieval Mindset That Birthed It Is." Welcome to Uprising, Amir.
Thank you for having me.
Well, first, before we turn to Dzhokar Tsarnaev and what's playing out here on U.S. soil, let's talk about ISIS and the latest situation in the northern Iraq, Syria region. How important is it for the U.S. to make an example of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi? He seems to have become the new Osama bin Laden, and the killing of bin Laden, when that happened, was considered this great Western triumph over fundamentalism.
Well, I think, first of all, it's important to state and to acknowledge that we need to hold criminals and terrorists accountable for their actions. So that goes without saying, really. And yes, in a sense, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi is sort of like a new Osama bin Laden. And, thankfully, Osama bin Laden was eliminated. And I think we can look at that only as a military triumph because we took out the head of Al-Qaeda. However, is it really a triumph over fundamentalism? Is it really a triumph over the ideology? Frankly, I don't think so. You can take out the leaders of these organizations, you can hurt them and maim them, but if the ideology is still there, if the factors that gave rise to these groups are still there, then it's not a triumph.
What do you make of the recent beheadings and shootings of Ethiopian Christians? This has not received very much attention in the U.S., although Pope Francis did strongly denounce the killings. And I'm wondering if the propaganda effect that ISIS is looking for through these barbaric videotaped killings might be waning, or is it just that Ethiopians are, not considered as important? It's easier to overlook them because, of course, these are Black Africans.
Well, I think it's three things. I think, yes, I do think that the shock factor of these videos is generally waning. Two, yes, I think that there is some truth to the fact, unfortunately, like we've seen it repeatedly again and again, and there does seem to be a pattern that, the deaths of Black Africans tend to be ignored by, general global media. And, maybe we can say, part of it is just, well, nobody really cares, and maybe it's a soft form of racism. But I think the bigger reason is it's just that, when the victims are Western, it's really Western media that tends to be very globally prominent. And so, Western media will pay attention to Western narratives that are of interest to Western audiences. And so, I think that's part of the bigger reason is just how the media dynamics really work. But despite having said that, the killings really have had a very, very terrible effect within Ethiopian communities. So even though these videos might have a waning effect, for the communities and the families of the victims, it's just a very, very horrible ordeal. I mean, the amount of grief, the outpouring of grief that was featured, in footage from Ethiopia is just extremely heartbreaking.
And so let's talk about the fact that if al-Baghdadi is incapacitated either through injury or through death, if he is outright killed, what impact would that actually have on ISIS? I mean, I can't imagine that it would necessarily deter them.
Yes, I completely agree with you. It will have hardly any kind of impact. I mean, if you just look at, the investigative reports that have been carried out by the New York Times and the German press, and even the Arabic press, it's just, he's a figurehead. Really, that's what he is primarily. And he was selected because he has a PhD in Islamic studies from the University of, Baghdad. And therefore, he would just kind of grant the movement sort of a religious legitimacy that they're trying to establish. But he's mostly a figurehead, and it wouldn't have any impact on them. And if he dies, they'll just declare him as a martyr, replace him with a new figurehead, and the show will continue because there still are many military generals who used to be part of Saddam Hussein's army and who are now part of ISIS, who are really running the show, and they're the real masterminds and the ones who are very capable.
In your widely read piece, which was published last summer entitled ISIS Isn't the Real Enemy, you say, quote, even if ISIS is militarily defeated in the short term, the mindset that helped birth it has become far too common. And so following up on what you were just saying, what do you specifically mean by that mindset?
Yeah, thank you for asking that question. It's a quote, so let me just give a bigger context for that quote. When I say the mindset has become far too common, I don't mean the mindset of killing and destroying and maiming, the actual terrorizing. But what I refer to in that piece is the mindset of people who want to see the removal of man-made secular law, the banishment of man-made secular law, and the establishment or return to God's original pure law. There are many mindsets that do wish to see a return to what's in Arabic called al-khilaf, or in English the caliphate, which has been getting all sorts of attention. There are a lot of people who want to see that. And do they necessarily support the methodologies of ISIS? I would say the majority, definitely no. But there are many who are sympathetic. And if you look at Saudi Arabia, I mean, Saudi Arabia beheads people, publicly, for all sorts of capital offenses. Saudi Arabia chops off hands for thievery. I mean, these are the punishments that we're criticizing ISIS for, yet Saudi Arabia is an American ally. And, the criticism is mum, and these things, these mindsets are present, not in all of Saudi society, but certainly in certain segments, and they're considered normative. And so that's extremely troubling, because once you support the establishment of the caliphate and you want to see a return to pure religious law, and you support these kind of really, nasty medieval punishments, then that's really the first step. And when you become very fervent and passionate about that, and other factors come into play, that could cross over into support for groups like ISIS, or participation in groups like ISIS.
Let's turn to the trial of Dzhokar Tsarnaev. He was convicted, I mentioned earlier in the month, of all 30 counts for which he was charged. And this is a very different scenario that's unfolding in terms of accountability for a terrorist act. And you mentioned earlier in our conversation that, of course, we do have to hold perpetrators of violence and criminals accountable. And I'm wondering what you make of the assertion by Tsarnaev's defense as the trial was playing out that this young man was influenced by his older brother Tamerlan, who was killed during the pursuit. How easy is it to be seduced by fundamentalist ideology?
Yeah, well, I think first of all, I'd like to state that the American justice system is not perfect. It's far from perfect. But just the very fact that Tsarnaev has a defense team and they can defend him on his behalf is really a testament to the positive aspects of the American legal system. And it's very impressive in its own right that this kind of trial is happening. It is the right thing to do.
I should just mention very briefly in our critiques of the trial, by the way, the fact that it was held in Massachusetts has come under strong criticism because, of course, of the emotional bias that naturally would exist. But I see your point as well, of course.
Right, definitely. And so, the defense team, of course, has to defend him. It's their job. That's how the whole system is set up. And so, they're going to try their best to reduce the punishment, to make sure that maybe he perhaps doesn't get executed, that he gets a life sentence, because from the reports that I've read, his lawyer doesn't want to see him get the death sentence. I think it's a she. She wants to see him get get life in prison. I believe that that's what it is.
And so in terms of the question of how easy it is to be seduced by fundamentalist ideologies, this defense, is this a valid defense? Because when this sort of thing happens, often parents of the children who might be seduced by this type of ideology are caught unawares. Often they're middle-class parents, at least, and well-educated families, at least those in the West that might find their children be seduced by some fundamentalist ideology, and it catches them unawares. It can tear a family apart.
Indeed. And it's an extremely, heartbreaking thing to witness. And, we have to look at radicalization on a case-by-case basis, frankly. Each case tends to be different. There are some similarities. It's always a combination of very personal grievances and, political and ideological sort of motives. And so when a mind is vulnerable, when someone feels isolated, has an identity crisis, feels a sense of humiliation because of whatever circumstances he or she went through, and then looks at the outer world and sees the humiliation of Muslims, and they start resonating with that humiliation, and then you bring in fundamentalist ideology into the equation, it's very seductive for a vulnerable mind like that. And so it's a tricky balance, because obviously, we can't take away a person's agency and the fact that they make their own decisions at the end of the day. But you are right. Some people tend to be more vulnerable, and therefore the ideology tends to be more seductive for them.
And now, during the sentencing phase of the trial, which is happening this week, the prosecutor is attempting to make the case that Tsarnaev is unrepentant. He was and he's unrepentant. The media are making a big deal about his, quote, defiance. And of course, this serves to create a hostile reaction among Americans who feel victimized, rightly so, by the Boston Marathon bombing. But it also feeds into this desire to see him executed. But doesn't that just feed the cycle of revenge and hatred?
I think that is a very wise question, And unfortunately, wisdom doesn't come in abundance these days. You are absolutely right. We could execute him, to impose justice, or sort of fulfill a desire for revenge. But at the end of the day, yes, it does feed that cycle of revenge. And it's not a popular perspective. I think it is really the truth. However, we do perpetuate violence. We do perpetuate this desire for revenge. And at the end of the day, just from a tactical perspective, by executing him, you're making him a martyr. I think he should be put in prison for life. I frankly hope that during his time in prison, he will come to repent. Finally, he will come to genuinely feel grief and regret for what he's done, and to then perhaps even share his story from behind the prison bars and state that what he did was wrong, and that he would encourage others who are maybe tempted to be radicalized to not go down that path, that it's not worth it, that it's extremely repulsive and appalling, to go down such a path to begin with. That's what I hope the outcome would be. And I do hope that the families of the victims will find some sort of closure.
We hear constantly of young Muslims being lured by ISIS propaganda, and some people say these reports are vastly inflated. They're small numbers of cases, but still they're inflated in the media. But it's quite difficult for Americans to understand what it is about ISIS barbarism that attracts seemingly well-educated, rational young people. And so the broader context of how Muslims' oppression is linked to Western policies, of course, is often left out of the equation. But these young folks might be seeing that more clearly, and is that what's attracting them to ISIS propaganda?
Well, certainly. I mean, when such minds, who are vulnerable to radicalization, see the oppression of Muslims and the destruction of Muslim lands, that is definitely a huge, major factor. But I wouldn't only just reduce it to that. Some just feel a sense of isolation, loneliness, no sense of purpose, a complete lack of meaning in their lives. I mean, if you look at the statements of people who've actually been radicalized, and when they explain their reasons, the reasons contain oppression. So they will mention, Muslims are oppressed, they're being bombed, they're being attacked. That comes up. But we have to acknowledge and also look at the other reasons that they state. They say, why would I, like, for instance, even people who have left the United States or Canada or Australia, this is in their statements. They've said, I could have been there and had the best materialistic, pleasures ever. I could have had the best that life had to give me, from a materialistic standpoint. But so what? What I want to do is I want to be a martyr in the eyes of God. I want the afterlife, and what the afterlife has to give me, not what this life has to provide. And so there's a lot of also ideological, reasons, religiously speaking, religious ideology that motivates these individuals to go out there and to take immense risks and to participate in these wars and these battles that give them a sense of glory and a sense of purpose. And for many, it can be very intoxicating and it can fill in that void, but it's a very, very sick and twisted kind of mindset, really.
Finally, this week also marked the 20th anniversary of the Oklahoma City bombing, which remains the worst domestic terrorist act in U.S. history. Far more people killed than the Boston Marathon bombing, 168 people killed. Can we see parallels to the radical ideology driving Timothy McVeigh and Dzhokar Tsarnaev? In the one case, political ideology, perhaps, and in the other case, religious.
Absolutely, 100% true. In one case, it's political ideology. In the case of Timothy McVeigh, was white supremacism. Photocopies of the white supremacist novel, I believe it was called the Turner Diaries. It was a novel that he read over and over again, and that had a fictional account of, U.S. government buildings being blown up. He was very inspired by that novel. It's a white supremacist novel. And then, of course, you have, somebody like Tsarnaev, who was, through his brother and through online radicalization, was inspired by jihadist content and propaganda. So yes, absolutely. One is just, political ideology. The other one tends to be religious ideology. And there are parallels. And their personal reasons and the external reasons. Both of these individuals were vulnerable, had a lot of social issues that they were going through, which made them very susceptible to becoming radicalized and doing such heinous things.
Well, I want to thank you so much, Amir, for joining us today and for shedding some light on these issues.
Thank you very much for having me. Appreciate it. Thank you.
My guest is Amir Nasr. He's a writer and educator, and his book is My Isl, How Fundamentalism Stole My Mind and Doubt Freed My Soul. He wrote an article that was widely read last year called ISIS Isn't the Real Enemy, the Game of Thrones Medieval Mindset That Birthed It Is, and we'll post that to our website at uprisingwithsonali.com later today. This is Uprising. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kohatkar. If you'd like to watch our TV show, tune in to Free Speech TV or subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/uprising with Sonali. Your subscription funds the TV production of this program. Nearly 2 years ago, a horrific human rights disaster unfolded in the impoverished South Asian nation of Bangladesh. More than 1,100 garment workers at a factory called Rana Plaza died when the building collapsed. The Western world, whose residents consume clothing made by Bangladeshi factory workers, was horrified. But all these months later, there's been little progress made in ensuring that workers' rights are respected. Human Rights Watch released a report on the occasion of the anniversary entitled "Whoever Raises Their Head Suffers the Most: Workers' Rights in Bangladesh's Garment Factories." In it, the group found that among workers at the 44 factories that it investigated, physical, sexual, and verbal abuses are rampant. Workers who attempt to organize are retaliated against. And the $30 million fund set up for compensating families of the victims of Rana Plaza is still $8 million short. Transnational clothing companies were pressured into donating to the fund. Inside Bangladesh, there have been major marches and rallies as activists urge their government to hold international corporations accountable. But the government is facing another set of problems: growing scrutiny over the recent killings of independent writers and bloggers. My guest is Tania Rashid. She is an international correspondent for Vice Media. Welcome to Uprising, Tania.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Well, the Rana Plaza disaster was such a huge story internationally that it really surprised me to see that even this fund set up to compensate survivors and victims' families has not been fulfilled. And it's a small amount. $30 million is nothing to these big companies, and you would have thought a single company could have donated that much as just a PR move.
Well, the truth is that the money's not properly allocated. I was at the factory site moments after the collapse happened, and I noticed, just being there, watching different government bureaucrats come in and try and pour in money, that there were maybe hundreds of people standing in line saying they didn't receive anything. But I also called Benetton, and their spokesperson declined to comment for months as well. It's only recently, I think, as a PR move that you mentioned, that they have offered $1.1 million. But again, it's a question of allocation. Do the funds reach the victims properly? I mean, they can't even find some of the dead bodies to this day, 2 years after the incident, and skulls are appearing at the site. What does that say?
And Benetton, you mentioned, is one of the companies that essentially contracts with factories in Bangladesh. And I understand that Benetton did finally make a donation to the compensation fund, but only after months of pressure by activists.
Yes, activists had to come in and demand the money. But again, I think it's a major PR move being made, because the 2-year anniversary is coming up and they know their necks are going to be on the line. And so they did it out of an act of whatever you want to call it. And why 2 years later? Why are they waiting 2 years later?
Right.
All the victims are traumatized and physically injured and have been waiting for how long for this?
Now, of course, a larger issue is changing the system so that another disaster like this doesn't happen, and so that ongoing abuses end and safety conditions, etc., are improved. Are companies like Benetton and The Gap and other major Western transnational companies relying on lax enforcement of safety standards and these terribly low wages in Bangladesh in order to do business there? Is the government being sort of held hostage to their threat that if they were to enforce rules, if they were to require higher wages, that these companies would just move elsewhere?
Well, there are a number of things happening here, right? So there's the subcontractors coming in, yeah, and they're only paying, I don't know the exact amount, but they're paying a certain amount of money to BGMA, the Bangladesh Garment Manufacturing Export Association. And so they're saying that they're only getting so much and they have to meet that demand when it comes to enforcing their workers. And so their workers don't get paid enough. But the truth is that 10% of the people who work at the Bangladesh Garments Exporting Association control the legislation in the country and represent the government. And they're the owners of the private garment factories. So they basically decide when the inspections happen and what's going to take place in the factories and how much the workers get paid. So it's like these are the people representing the country, and they're also the ones controlling the workers. So the workers, do they have a voice? That's my question. They really don't.
How have workers been organizing at the grassroots in the wake of the Rana Plaza disaster? And I should mention, of course, there is a long tradition of worker organizing in Bangladesh and countries in South Asia, but particularly since the Rana Plaza disaster, what are they specifically asking for? Are they demanding unions to be stronger? Are they demanding for higher wages, or all of the above?
You know, the truth is that I've been to many factories in Bangladesh, even before the Rana Plaza collapse. And majority of the workers are women, 4 million of them, right? And I saw firsthand how women are treated inside those factories. They face sexual abuse, they face verbal abuse, and they really don't have a voice. And the people who do stand up for them, these union organizers that come in, they get threatened by the government. They get threatened by different forces that tell them to be quiet. So either their lives, so it's one of two things: their lives get threatened, or they get bribed off to be quiet. And so that's why the organizing for unions in Bangladesh is just very difficult.
So in terms of the Western responses to Rana Plaza, the Rana Plaza disaster 2 years ago, one effort that is making the rounds online is this website called fashionrevolution.org that challenges people to know where their clothes are made and raises awareness of the Rana Plaza disaster. They're calling on people to hold signs that say, "Who made my clothes?" and post them to social media on April 24th, which is tomorrow, the actual anniversary of the disaster, as a way to raise awareness. Do you have an opinion on this effort? I mean, can we really tweet and Facebook our way to justice on this issue?
I think it's really bizarre. Who made my clothes? Why don't you just look at your tag? I think the question we should be asking is, why are these people making my clothes? And what conditions are these people working under to make my clothes? And why does America have this obsession with consumerism? And like, we have fast food, we have fast clothing. What is going on here? We need to ask deeper questions. And it just sounds like a Coney campaign to me, like they did before, where you're just not tackling the real issues, but looking at it from a superficial perspective. I think it's ridiculous.
Joseph Kony, the African warlord that was wanted by the United States, and you're referring to the social media campaign here in the U.S. that came under fire for being pretty short-sighted. Well, I understand that inside Bangladesh, where we're not getting much access to in terms of our media coverage here, in places like the capital, Dhaka, there are activists and workers that are planning to surround the National Press Club, create a human chain. They're going to be laying flowers at the site of the disaster. How big of an issue is the Rana Plaza disaster inside Bangladesh, even among those who are not directly connected to the garment industry?
It's the largest industrial disaster that's happened in human history. I mean, if you think about the world, how massive that is, and then you think of a small country like Bangladesh, imagine how much it impacted the people. I mean, when I was there, I noticed volunteers from all walks of life coming in, students, older folks, everyone. I mean, people who had nothing to do with the incident just to help and get people out of the building. So it was like a major, 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 major tragedy in the country. And I think, yes, it makes sense why it's being commemorated because it symbolizes just, I mean, there's thousands of garment factories in Bangladesh. So it just symbolizes the reality of the situation there for a majority of 4 million of its female citizens.
It's interesting that you bring up the context of it. I mean, when we look at U.S. history, one of the seminal historical moments of labor was in 1911 when the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in New York resulted in the deaths of 123 women and girls. And it was the stain on the labor history of the United States, also prompted a lot of labor organizing. In Bangladesh's case, we're talking about more than 1,100, mostly women and girls. And so a disaster of the scale 10 times greater than one that changed the course of U.S. history.
Absolutely, and it's also important to mention that during the Industrial Revolution, there was a major fight for unionizing, and the problem in Bangladesh is there is the fight, but people are shutting them down. I mean, there was a union activist who was brutally murdered, and no one likes to talk about that. These union leaders are putting their lives on the line, and even then, like, they can't properly organize. So what happens? These women don't get rights. They don't get help. They get paid under these abysmal wages.
So speaking of murders that are politically motivated, I want to also turn to the string of recent murders of bloggers and writers inside Bangladesh. In February, a man named Avijit Roy, who was actually an American Bangladeshi writer, was killed in Dhaka. He was hacked to death by men wielding machetes. Imran Sarkar, the head of the Bangladesh Bloggers Association, organized protest in response, and he said that, quote, Avijit's killing once again proved that there is a culture of impunity in the country. Do you agree about this culture of impunity?
Yeah, there are things happening in the country where people who have a voice that kind of speaks differently about Islam is seen in a negative light. And now this is mostly because in southern Bangladesh, there is an uprising of Islamists called Anasurallah Bangla Team. And these guys are brainwashed in madrasas and they are taught to, kill. They don't even know what a blogger is. Most of these guys, they don't know how to read and write. They get fed in the madrasas. And so they come up and they're just like, their leaders tell them, kill this person because he's speaking against the Prophet or speaking against Islam. And so Avijit and these other bloggers like Rahman have just been speaking their minds and taking a secular stance on religion. They support people like Bill Maher and they just have their own stance on religion.
Right, they're strongly atheist.
And so that is very much shunned upon in Bangladesh. So a lot of these people who come in, the southern Bangladeshis, the people from southern Bangladesh, these Islamists come in and they just kill. And then the funny thing is the police, you're talking about the culture of impunity, the police just come in, the police are there while it's happening, like with Rahman, and they watch.
Well, there was another Bangladeshi blogger since the killing of Avijit Roy that happened in late March, Washikur Rahman, 27-year-old young man, also killed, also hacked to death by knives. So what sort of response has there been from the government? I understand that there has been, at least from urban parts of Bangladesh, strong pressure on the government to do something about this because clearly, as you said, the police are standing by watching and the killers are not necessarily being held accountable.
Well, the government has clearly condemned the attacks, but aside from that, I don't think I've seen
So just a verbal lip service?
Yeah, just this is not right. This should not be happening. And to mind you, I've made some pretty controversial films on gang rape happening in Bangladesh, and I myself have received death threats and threats of being, gang raped from who knows who. And so I think it's just...
How have you received those threats?
I've received the threats by Facebook message, by email, just as Washikur Rahman did and Avijat Roy. It's the same thing. And I've been discouraged from going back to Bangladesh for a little bit for that reason.
And has that had a chilling effect on writers and thinkers on Bangladesh, not just those who might want to travel there as you do, but people living inside?
Absolutely. It's a very dangerous place. I mean, it's at risk of, if the government doesn't take action right now, the Bangladesh could become another Afghanistan.
Wow.
The risk is real. The risk is raw. It's very bad right now.
Finally, the last time we had you on our program, Tania, it was to discuss the rivalry between two of Bangladesh's political leaders, Sheikh Hasina and Khaleda Zia. Hasina is now prime minister. The two of them have sort of swapped the seat various times over the year. The New York Times published a piece last week entitled "Turmoil Between Political Leaders Has Harmed Bangladesh's People." Is that true? And does that feed into the danger facing the country that we've just been discussing?
This feud between Begum Khaleda Zia and Sheikh Hasina, gosh, has been happening for so many years. And I think I would like to speak to the general apathy of the public, the people, because I ask around when I'm on an auto rickshaw or when I'm walking down the street, I'll ask people, which party do you, where do you stand? And everybody just says, can we just not have it at all? I mean, there's just this sense of apathy. And yeah, the risk is very real. I mean, again, BNP, the Bangladesh Nationalist Party, Khaleda Zia's party, the opposition party, her party is tied to the Islamist organizations. And so I think they are, the people who have alliances with her party are the ones coming in and provoking a lot of violence. And the Awami League has, and then the Awami League has its flaws because they've come in as a secular party, but they're kind of like a dictatorship.
So this is Sheikh Hasina's party.
Yes, and so they haven't really done, there's just like a big mess.
Well, the story of a stranglehold of two major parties that are more alike than different is a familiar one to many countries, including here in the United States. I want to thank you so much, Tania, for joining us today, and best of luck to you in your work.
Thank you.
Tania Rashid, my guest, is an international correspondent for Vice magazine. We've been talking about Bangladesh. The second anniversary of the Rana Plaza disaster is tomorrow. This is Uprising. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Golhatkar. We turn now to yet another anniversary. 5 years ago today, then Governor of Arizona, Jan Brewer, signed into law one of the most controversial pieces of state legislation on immigration in recent memory. Senate Bill 1070, the Support Our Law Enforcement and Safe Neighborhoods Act, enabled police in Arizona to demand immigration documents of anyone they stopped, detained, or arrested. Failure to have proper federal documentation resulted in a misdemeanor crime in the state. The law also gave a broad latitude to police officers to enforce federal immigration laws and criminalized the transportation, hiring, or shelter of undocumented immigrants. Passage of SB 1070 prompted major protests all over the nation, including calls to boycott Arizona. While the state legislature attempted to amend the law to address some of the concerns, it mostly remained intact. Meanwhile, legal challenges to SB 1070 made their way through the U.S. Supreme Court, with justices rendering a mixed decision in 2012. Many of the most draconian sections of SB 1070 remain unchanged, that is. How has Arizona been transformed over the past 5 years by what people are referring to as the Show Me Your Papers law? And how are immigrants' rights activists marking this 5th anniversary? Joining me to answer those questions is Gerardo Torres. He is an activist with the group Puente, based in Arizona. Welcome to Uprising, Gerardo. Thanks for joining us. Well, first, can you explain, because it is a little confusing, which aspects of SB 1070 remain intact after the Supreme Court ruling? What can Arizona police legally do to undocumented immigrants, and what are they actually barred from doing?
For SB 1070 is one part of the deportation machine from the federal government. SB 1070 and Sheriff Arpaio are the ones deporting the victims of SB 1070, even with the executive action from President Obama. And we believe at the end of that, the president time on office, he's going to be probably deporting about 3 million people.
And so what specifically can police legally do to undocumented immigrants in Arizona that other police in other states aren't allowed to do?
One of the worst parts that they left is that any police officer can stop you if they suspect that you are undocumented on this state. It doesn't, I mean, it's for your skin color, the way you speak English, or if you don't speak English at all, or even the way you dress.
And they can ask you to show show proof that you're actually a citizen of the country, and if you can't show proof, then you enter essentially the immigration deportation system?
Yes.
Now, as far as you know, how many undocumented immigrants have actually been impacted directly by SB 1070 in the last 5 years, just in terms of being arrested, then determined to be undocumented, having entered the system? Is anyone keeping track of these numbers?
We don't have an exact number of people being on that affected, but I've seen them around my neighborhoods, around the state. There is a lot of people being hurt, a lot of people being detained and going through the process of being deported. We were able to fight back and stop the deportations from a lot of members of the community by working case by case.
And so it's just been one at a time. Now, proponents of the law insist that it doesn't result in racial profiling of Latinos in particular. And have the past 5 years given light to that? Have the past 5 years shown that, in fact, what has happened is specifically racial profiling of Latinos in particular?
At this moment that we're talking, Joe Arpaio is right now answering to the court. I've been able to attend the court hearings, and everything points out as there being a lot of racial profiling in the community.
And Joe Arpaio, of course, the notorious sheriff of Maricopa County in Arizona, and you brought him up earlier as well, he seems to have been the singular person to use SB 1070 most effectively as a tool to target immigrants. Why is he in court specifically?
For contempt to the court. He was supposed to stop the raids and racial profiling, and I believe it's about 17 months he didn't stop, and that's why he is in court right now.
Now, I understand, has ICE agents posted in the sheriff's department. Is that true?
Yes. There is a collaboration with the police officers, the sheriff department, and ICE.
And
working
ICE
together.
being the Immigration and Customs Enforcement, which is an arm of the Department of Homeland Security. Why is ICE cooperating with them? And what are groups doing to try to remove ICE agents or to legally organize to get these agents out of the Sheriff's Department?
A lot of these detention centers are private, and that's the only way they can keep. That's the only way they can keep getting money and getting more
more funding.
More funding, yeah. That's the only way they can keep up with and also they have a quota that they have to meet. So it's about 400,000 deportations a year that they have to do.
So ICE has a quota of deportations?
Yes.
And so Sheriff Arpaio is complying with that. And just to make it clear for our audience, around the country, and it has traditionally been so, law enforcement is not supposed to enforce immigration laws. It's an issue of public safety. Undocumented immigrants should be able to call the police in cases of domestic violence or other crimes that they might see happening. But if the police are going to then ask them for their papers, it deters them from calling the police in the first place, thereby making public safety, jeopardizing the issue of public safety. And in Arizona, those lines between the law enforcement and immigration authorities has been significantly blurred by SB 1070. How has the adoption of SB 1070 financially hurt Arizona? I mentioned 5 years ago there were calls to boycott Arizona, and the Center for American Progress did a study showing that the city of Phoenix alone, in the 4 months after SB 1070 was passed, Phoenix lost $141 million in tourism and convention industry businesses. Do you have a sense of whether Arizona as a state has lost money because of adopting this law?
Yes, I've seen them around the neighborhoods. I have a friend that he used to live in Mesa, Arizona. He owned a convenience store. And after SB 1070 passed, he packed up his stuff and moved his business to New Mexico. So it's just like that. It's more business, and also people live in the state just because of SB 1070.
So businesses, or some businesses, decided not to engage with the state in opposition to the law. But then you're saying that in addition to that, immigrants or people simply with brown skin who don't want to be racially profiled have actually left the state out of fear and just distaste for the law?
Yes. Also, when I go visit my family in California, they live in Pomona, and I invite them to come over, and they don't wanna come over because they're like brown skin just like me. And they don't want to be bothering by people asking them for their papers. And they are legal, they're documented.
So Arizona is also losing tourism dollars.
Yes.
Now, Al Jazeera English covered the 5th anniversary of SB 1070 with a story of how a young undocumented woman who thought she was eligible for President Obama's Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, or DACA program, was earning money or trying to make enough money to save up to apply for DACA. But then she was rounded up in a workplace raid in Arizona, ended up being imprisoned. All of the money that she had saved up, she had to spend at the prison commissary. Are you hearing are stories like this increasingly common?
Yes, they're pretty common here in Phoenix. I actually know Noemi, and
she was
like
the young
her,
woman who's profiled in the article, yeah.
Yes, she, like her, there is a lot of people, young people being affected by this too. And not just that, but there is a lot of queer, undocumented young people, trans people, gay people, queer people being affected by these laws. I have some of my friends, like Carolina, she was walking down the street and she was detained by the police, and she was processed through the ICE, the police department, and all that. So we were able to stop her deportation, and I mean, she's still in the process, but we stopped the deportation at that moment.
Now, Gerardo, you are an openly gay immigrant who's been speaking, an activist who's been speaking out about these issues. Why are gay undocumented immigrants more vulnerable?
The way they're treated inside detention centers, they're put in solitary confinement just because just because they're gay.
Yeah.
They like trans women sometimes are kept with male people on the detention centers, and they're being mistreated. Some of them being raped, like Marichui. They're being psychological damage to them too. So
and also, Gerardo, then the upside of the SB 1070 story over the last 5 years, I understand, has also been that communities have become much more active and much more organized. How have ordinary people and groups like Puente responded to SB 1070? What has the sort of vibrant organizing come out of this?
We came out of the shadows, came out of the closets, and we stood up and fight back. That's why we're celebrating 5 years of resistance, and we still resisting every day here in Arizona.
How are people marking the anniversary? Are there specific events, rallies planned?
This afternoon, we're going to be having a march from the state capitol to 4th Avenue Jail, where our Joe Arpaio is right now.
And what about the new governor of Arizona, Doug Ducey? Does he have a different position on SB 1070 than his predecessor, Jan Brewer, who signed this into law, did?
I think we haven't heard from here like that, but he's a Republican, and we believe that he probably agrees with SB 1070.
And so he's likely to continue the same regime of SB 1070 as Brewer did?
Yes.
Are you hopeful that the court hearing that Arpaio is involved in right now around racial profiling can have any positive impact?
Yes, because there is a lot of things coming out up to the light. There is a lot of the truth is coming out. So.
And so he might, at least specifically, the one who is enforcing SB 1070 the most strongly, might be curbed in the way he's doing this. But of course, the law still remains. Are there legal challenges as well that are in the works?
Yes, they are. But we want to keep fighting. That's what we're doing.
Well, I want to thank you very much, Gerardo, for joining us today. Is there a website you'd like to give out for our audience?
It's puenteaz.org.
That's puenteaz, AZ for Arizona.org, where my guest Gerardo Torres is based. Best of luck in the commemorations this afternoon, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much.
My guest Gerardo Torres is an activist with the group Puente, and today is the 5th anniversary of the signing into law of SB 1070 by then Governor Jan Brewer. This is Uprising. Bipasha Shom is our senior producer. Anna Buss is our assistant producer. Christian Beck is our production coordinator. Alexander Hobbs is our technical director. Federico Garcia is our audio engineer. Annie Mendoza is our social media coordinator. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/uprising with Sonali, where you can get exclusive access to all of our TV shows. Our website is uprisingwithsonali.com. Our theme music is by Quetzal. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar, host and executive producer of Uprising. I'll see you next time.